Welcome back, Deep Divers. We're diving headfirst into a Supreme Court case today, one that really got people talking. It's the American Legion versus American Humanist Association.
This one went to some pretty interesting places.
It did. So basically, we're looking at this 40-foot Latin cross right smack in the middle of Bladensburg, Maryland.
A big one.
Oh yeah, hard to miss. And it was put up way back in 1925 to honor 49 local guys who died in World War I. But the question the court had to grapple with was, does a giant cross on public land violate the First Amendment? Specifically, that whole separation of church and state thing, the Establishment Clause.
Right, because the government's not supposed to be in the business of endorsing one religion over another, or religion in general.
Exactly. And in the end, the court decided the cross could stay. So we're going to unpack how they got to that decision and what it means for everyone, really.
Sound like a plan.
Now, this monument, it's called the Peace Cross, and it's pretty impressive. 40 feet tall, as we said, dedicated in 1925 by the American Legion.
You can't miss it. And it's got these words etched into the base, valor, endurance, courage, devotion, like right there, boom.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah. And then there's this plaque with the names of all 49 of the World War I veterans. It's really something.
What's interesting is how the area around the Peace Cross has changed over time. It wasn't always in the middle of a park.
Right. Like nowadays, it's in this place called Veterans Memorial Park. And there are memorials for all kinds of conflicts.
All kinds, yeah. World War II, Pearl Harbor, Korea, Vietnam, even 9/11, the War of 1812, and some markers for the Battle of Bladensburg, which happened right there.
Wow. So it's really surrounded.
It is. But it's funny, even though it's surrounded, the closest monument is still like 200 feet away. So it's kind of on its own little island. Well, a traffic island, technically.
A traffic island? How'd it end up there?
Well, that's a good question. Back in 1961, the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, they took over the cross and the land it's on, partly to preserve it, keep it from falling apart.
Makes sense. It's almost 100 years old.
Right. But also because that intersection was getting busier and it was a safety hazard, so they figured make it part of a park and that'll solve a few problems.
Practical and historical, two birds with one stone.
Exactly. And since then, the commission, they've spent a good chunk of change keeping the cross in good shape, even doing some renovations.
So it's definitely a priority for them.
Oh, yeah. And for the community, too. I mean, for almost 100 years, the Peace Cross has been the place for the community to remember and honor veterans.
Yeah.
Since it was first dedicated, they've held all sorts of patriotic events there.
Like what kind of events?
Oh, the usual. Speeches from local leaders, maybe some music, prayers. Sometimes they'll have someone give a benediction at the end.
So it's got this long history of being a central part of their traditions, a place to come together.
Absolutely. But not everyone was happy with the cross being there, and that's where this court case comes in.
Right, because there's that separation of church and state thing.
Yeah, and the American Humanist Association, they brought the case, arguing that the Peace Cross was violating the Establishment Clause. They said having this huge Christian symbol on public land and using taxpayer money to keep it up was basically the government saying, hey, we're cool with Christianity.
So their argument was that it was a little too close to the government endorsing a specific religion. I could see their point.
Yeah, and their main issue was the cross itself. I mean, it's the ultimate symbol of Christianity for a lot of people. And they said by having it up there on public land, the government was basically saying, Christianity, that's the preferred religion around here.
Which can make people who aren't Christian feel like second-class citizens, like they don't belong.
Exactly. It's like saying, you're welcome here, but you're not quite one of us. And that creates a real sense of division, doesn't it?
It does, and that's the opposite of what the Establishment Clause is all about. It's supposed to make sure everyone feels like they're on equal footing, regardless of their religion.
Right. But there was another side to this whole symbolism thing, too. Some folks argued that if you try to, take the religious meaning out of the cross, to make it secular.
To tone it down.
Yeah, tone it down. Some people said that would be super offensive to a lot of Christians, almost like sacrilege.
Like you're messing with something sacred. Yeah, I get that. It's a tough situation because you're trying to balance respecting everyone's beliefs, but the symbol itself has so much weight for different people.
Totally. So let's talk about the other side, the folks who wanted the Peace Cross to stay put. The American Legion and the Park and Planning Commission, they had their own arguments. And a big one was that over the years, the cross had taken on a more secular meaning. at least in that community.
So they were saying it wasn't just about Christianity anymore.
Yeah, they were saying it had become more about remembering those specific World War I veterans, that it was a symbol of sacrifice and loss.
And they made a comparison to all the crosses in military cemeteries, right?
They did. They said, in that context, the cross is more about honoring the dead, no matter what their religion was.
So they're saying it's less about the religious aspect and more about a shared experience of grief and remembrance.
Right. And they also pointed to the historical context. Back when World War I ended, crosses were pretty much the standard way to memorialize fallen soldiers, especially in Europe.
Oh, right. Like those rows and rows of white crosses you see pictures of.
Exactly. So they said in that historical moment, the cross was a widely accepted symbol, not necessarily tied to one specific religion.
Okay, so they're bringing in the historical argument.
They are. Plus, they said the Peace Cross had become a huge part of the Bladensburg community itself. Like, it's been there so long, it's part of their identity. To tear it down now would be...
Like erasing a part of their history?
Yeah, and some people felt it would be like the government being hostile to religion, period.
And to support that, they brought up other examples of religious things being part of public life, right?
Right. They pointed to the towns named Bethlehem or Las Cruces or state mottos that reference God. They said, look, we have all these religious references in our everyday lives, and nobody's saying those are unconstitutional.
So they're saying it's all about context, right? That a cross in a cemetery or a town named Bethlehem doesn't mean the government's suddenly pushing Christianity.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, when does a symbol become more than just a symbol?
Exactly. That's the million-dollar question. And that seems to be what the Supreme Court was really grappling with in this case.
So let's dive into their decision. Chief Justice Roberts, he wrote the majority opinion, and he said the court needs to be more flexible, more understanding of the context when they're dealing with these old monuments.
Because things were different back then, right? The meaning might have shifted over time.
Right. So they weren't going to just blindly apply the Lemon test, which is what they usually use for these separation of church and state cases.
The Lemon test, that one's always a head-scratcher.
It is. But the big takeaway from Roberts' opinion was this idea that the meaning of religious symbols can change over time. Like, what might have started as a purely religious thing can gradually become more secular, more about the community, the history.
So even if a monument had religious roots, it doesn't mean it's still primarily about religion. It's evolved.
Exactly. And they use this really interesting example, the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris.
Beautiful building.
It is. And it's obviously Catholic, right? But it's also become a symbol of France itself, of French history and culture. People of all faiths and no faith, they see it as a national treasure.
So its meaning is bigger than just its religious function.
Exactly. And the court said the Peace Cross is kind of similar. It started as a religious symbol, but over time, it's taken on this added meaning of remembering those veterans, honoring sacrifice.
So they're saying the context really matters. A 100-year-old cross that's part of a town's history is different from, say, someone trying to put up a brand new cross in a public park today.
100%. Now, we should mention, Justice Thomas, he had his own opinion, a concurring opinion. He was more focused on whether the Establishment Clause even applies to state and local governments, through the 14th Amendment.
That's getting into some serious constitutional weeds.
It is. But basically, he was questioning whether the Founding Fathers intended the Establishment Clause to restrict state and local governments in the same way it does the federal government.
Makes you think, doesn't it? Like, how much power did they intend the federal government to have over these sorts of things?
For sure. Now, on the other side, Justice Ginsburg, she wrote a dissent, and she was joined by Justice Sotomayor. And her big concern was, what message does this giant cross send to people who aren't Christian?
Yeah, I was thinking about that earlier.
She was saying, even if it's old, even if it has this historical meaning, the fact that it's on public land, paid for with public money, it still feels like the government is favoring Christianity.
It's that feeling of exclusion that the Establishment Clause is supposed to prevent.
Exactly. But the majority of the court, they decided that the Peace Cross had become primarily a secular memorial, and taking it down would actually be hostile towards religion.
So they were trying to find that balance, right? Respecting the history, the community's feelings, but also the principle of not endorsing one religion over another.
Yeah, it was a tough one, no doubt. But ultimately, they sided with the idea that the Peace Cross's main meaning in that specific context was about remembering those veterans, not promoting Christianity.
So it really came down to context. What a fascinating case, and it really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. All right, let's shift gears now to our 10th chair segment, where we put on our imaginary Supreme Court robes and pretend we're deciding this case. So if I were up there, I'd be really torn.
I bet. Like, on the one hand, you've got these 49 guys who died in World War I. The community clearly feels a strong connection to this monument, and tearing it down would feel,
Like slapped in the face?
yeah, like disrespecting their memory and their history.
Absolutely. And the fact that it's been there for almost 100 years, that it was built in a time when crosses were common for war memorials, that all matters too.
But on the other hand, you can't just ignore the Establishment Clause. That's a fundamental part of our Constitution. And that cross, it is a religious symbol no matter how you slice it.
No, you can't get around that. And Justice Ginsburg's point about how it makes non-Christians feel, that sticks with me. It must be tough to see this giant symbol of a religion you don't belong to right there on public land, paid for with your tax dollars.
And feeling like the government is saying this is the real American religion, even if that's not their intent.
It sends a message, whether they mean to or not. So I'd have to weigh all that. I think the age of the monument, the context, it all leans me towards upholding the decision.
Because changing things now, after so long, could do more harm than good.
Yeah, I think so. But I'd also want to be really clear that this isn't a free pass for any religious symbol on public land. It's about the specifics of this case, this monument, and its history in that community. It's a very fine line we're walking here, respecting the past while also upholding everyone's rights.
It is. We want to honor veterans, but
Yeah.
we also want to make sure everyone in our country feels included and respected.
It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where we can do both.
In this case shows just how tricky that can be. So, at the end of the day, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Peace Cross, saying it didn't violate the Establishment Clause.
They really emphasized the historical context, that whole idea that the cross had taken on this secular meaning over time as a tribute to those World War I veterans.
And that it had become deeply embedded in the community's life. Like, it wasn't just some random cross someone stuck up there yesterday.
Right. It was almost a century old, and that history carried a lot of weight. This whole case, it really shows how complex these issues can be, right? When you're trying to balance religious freedom with the separation of church and state, especially when it comes to these old monuments.
It's never black and white, is it? And this case really highlights how the court has to grapple with these evolving meanings, these changing perceptions of what a symbol represents.
Exactly. And it leaves us with some pretty big questions to chew on. How do we, as a society, balance preserving our history with making sure everyone feels included and respected, regardless of their faith?
And how do we understand the way these symbols change over time? What they mean to us now versus what they might have meant 100 years ago?
It's definitely something to keep thinking about. So to all our deep drivers out there, keep those questions in mind. Maybe check out some other Supreme Court cases about the Establishment Clause or the history of war memorials.
There's so much to learn, and this case is just the tip of the iceberg.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.